To save time, I can help a lot of you decide on a Dark Elf army or not in the first 30 seconds or so. Look down at your fingernails. If any of them are black for any reason besides a hammer accident, this is probably your faction. Furthermore, every female Dark Elf character is portrayed as a glam rock dominatrix. And if that sentence awoken anything in you, log off the video, get on eBay, you found your faction. And finally, if you ever watched those awful Purge movies and thought to yourself, yeah, I can see how this could work, you found your faction, congratulations. For anyone still watching, this is what you need to know before starting Dark Elves. Starting an army for a wargame, especially one like the Old World, is actually a pretty big commitment, not only monetarily, but in time. Assuming you're building up to at least 2,000 points, you're probably looking at around at least 6 months to paint, if not years. So it's worth doing the research and make sure you make the right choice. God forbid you spend 5 months painting up a high elf army, and then realize you don't suck as a person, so you have to start all over on something new. And when it comes to factions like the Dark Elves, we have that added layer of dealing with the fact that it is officially not an official army and might not be supported. What does that mean, and what will it mean going forward? These are all things you should probably answer before committing. So let's get going, starting with their lore and background. Dark Elf lore is a history of betrayal. First they were spurned by their chief god, and then they were spurned by their kin, and then they were spurned by their creators when they refused to let them join the Old World as an official faction, yet refused to do anything with them in Age of Sigmar as well. Of all of GW's original fantasy factions, nobody has been more betrayed than the Dark Elves at this point. Even the Tomb Kings and Bretonnian had a better outcome, and GW spent like a whole decade pretending they didn't exist. I mean, even the Chaos Dwarves had official support in Age of Sigmar before Dark Elves have gotten anything, and there's like 5 people who've ever collected them. And before you finish typing that comment, no, the Daughters of Cain don't count. That's like convincing me to go to a Lakers game to watch James play, and then subjecting me to 48 minutes of Bronny. It's not the same, bro. It's a lesser offspring. And yeah, I just tried to make a sports joke in a Warhammer video. It's called Expanding Your Horizons. But back to the task at hand. Elven lore in Warhammer is actually very deep with quite a bit of nuance, so I'm just going to go over the Spark Notes version here. If you want to get more in depth with it, there are a lot of videos about the history of Dark Elves that you can find on YouTube. Basically, the Dark Elves exist as a cult of personality forged by their tyrant king Malekith, who has recently grown so fearful of Disney that he changed his name to Malarian.
Now, do we have a problem?
No, sir. No, Mr. Mouse. No, Mr. Mouse.
Oh, that's good, because I thought we had a problem for a minute there.
Malarian was the son of the greatest elven king, Anarion, and felt it was his birthright to succeed him on the Phoenix throne. However, because of Anarion's cursed bloodline, or maybe just because he was a Nepo baby, Malarian was kind of a huge dick and more than a little bloodthirsty. So his ascension was opposed by the majority of the nobility, and if you ignore the end times lore for a moment, their pantheon of heavenly gods. Fights break out, words were said, yada yada yada. The first Elven Civil War happens, Malarian ends up burned and encased in the fantasy version of Darth Vader's armor, and his entire faction exiled to Warhammer Canada. Just like in the real world, Warhammer Canada proved to be a harsh and unforgiving environment. But unlike the real world, Fantasy Canada and its harsh environment just brought out the worst in these exiled elves. Propped up by their angry and bitter followers, Malarian and his mother forged a new elven society as hateful and paranoid as they were. They dedicated themselves to a new pantheon of gods, a pantheon of gods whose major holidays all seem to revolve around murder. Their superiority complex was now unrestrained, and seeing themselves above most things, their economy became almost entirely dependent on slave runs from the Old World. Their society became warped around gaining personal power and revenge against the Dark Elves. And in a society where might makes right, the best way to gain more personal power is to murder your immediate superior. And these power struggles were occasionally spiced up with the Murder God holiday. And if you're asking yourself, how can a society built on murdering each other thrive and survive? Don't think about it too much. Just enjoy the ride and the battle bikinis. The edgy extremes of the Dark Elves are the point. And it all comes together into one of the more fun backgrounds in Warhammer Fantasy. The edgy hypocrisy of feeling superior to everything while not acknowledging that their whole society has collapsed and they're forced into piracy and slave trading just to survive makes them very fun antagonists and even funner anti-heroes, desperate to reclaim what they feel has been stolen from them. However, I do have one nitpick. GW has been very inconsistent with the Dark Elves' relationship with chaos. For example, look at the pleasure cults. In some lore tidbits, they are nests of Slaaneshi corruption, with Morathi as their high priest. At other times, Morathi was using the pleasure cults and Slaanesh but was not directly corrupted by him. And yet still later, the pleasure cults had absolutely nothing to do with chaos and instead one of the darker elven pantheon gods, making their orgies the only non-Slaaneshi ones in the old world. It gives the guy a bit of whiplash. And that's before even bringing the end times into this. I know people like to pretend otherwise, but they did happen. And spoilers, but it turns out Malarian's burning was all a big misunderstanding. He's been favored by the Phoenix King the whole time, and when Asurian empowered the High Elves to kill Dark Elves, he just did it for the laughs, even though he was supporting the Dark Elves. It just makes no sense. But even if we just stick to the time period of the Old World, we have some lore inconsistencies to deal with when it comes to the Dark Elves. When GW released the article saying which factions would be legacy and which would be supported, they tried to give lore reasons. They mentioned that at this time the Dark Elves were insular facing and not interfacing with the rest of the world. But this never made sense for the Druchii, who are reliant on slave raids to keep their economy going. If anything, they should interact with the Old World more than their High Elf brethren. In addition, the Old World is about 100 years before the 12th Everchosen in his invasion of the Old World. Around that same time, the Dark Elves should be entering into an alliance with Chaos to reinvade Ulthuan, which not only is that not very insular, but that also goes against the current, more modern Dark Elf lore where they're very anti-chaos. And I do understand that these are very nerdy nitpicks, and I also understand a lot of them can be hand-waved away as just times change. But I think the lore and background is the beating heart of this game, and I think to truly enjoy your army, you have to truly enjoy their background, so it's worth bringing these things up. But the issue that's probably more on your mind is their status as a legacy faction. Look, the first thing you need to know is that as of right now, legacy factions are not welcome in GW-sponsored or hosted tournaments. For most of us, that doesn't matter. We don't play in GW stores, we don't play in GW tournaments. But if you fantasize about playing in an official tournament at some point, Dark Elves and other legacy factions are probably not for you. And obviously, you're probably aware legacy status means no new units are coming for your faction. And that likely means no further development for your faction's lore as well. As long as they are legacy, the best Dark Elves fans can hope for is that GW produces a High Elf blurb that mentions them and doesn't change the name of an established Dark Elf character. And that might be fine at first, but as time goes on, it might be harder and harder to see your friends get new units, new characters, new ways to compose their armies, while your faction will always play the same as it does right now. Take it from somebody who plays as Bretonnia, it really sucks to be playing with an army that's 2 editions behind everybody else. But more worrying than just not getting any new toys is that as time goes on, the legacy factions may fall further and further behind rules-wise, power-wise. And just to be clear, that is not the case right now, where legacy armies play very well and some of them are quite strong. And to be fair, so far, GW has done a great job not introducing power creep when it comes to the old world, with the exception of a few new units from Cathay. But some drift is inevitable, and it starts to add up. Take, for example, the Dread Halberds of the Blackguard of Naggarond. On release, these weapons were supposed to be a more powerful version of the halberds from the core book, an exclusive perk for the Dark Elves. But halberds got a buff in the 1.5 rules update, and Dread Halberds, being legacy and technically a separate weapon, did not. So now, Dread Halberds are objectively worse than the generic version, and the Blackguards have no access to the upgraded halberds from the main book, at least without your opponent agreeing to bend the rules. And now the most elite soldiers the Dark Elves have to field are outfitted worse than a generic soldier of the Empire. It's a small problem for now, but it is an example of what I expect to get worse and worse as time goes on. But the good news is that when GW drops the ball, the community picks it back up. The YouTube channel Squared Base released and is maintaining tweaked set of legacy rules that they called Renegade Package. They don't take a heavy-hand approach, it's really just tweaks here and there to make the factions more enjoyable. And they seem widely accepted by the community. The popular army building apps like New Recruit also incorporates these rule sets so you can use them inside their app, which is a really nice addition. You can't force people to let you use these rule tweaks, but most groups are going to allow it. I've even seen most tournaments allow them at this point. It seems to be the way the community is headed. I don't know if the legacy factions or any variation of the legacy factions will ever make it into the old world. But I do know for sure, even if that were to happen, it likely wouldn't be until years in the future. But in the meantime, my advice would be for the good of your communities and all Warhammer communities is to embrace these fan edits to these legacy rules so everybody has a more enjoyable time, whether they're using the legacy factions or not. Moving on. Sourcing your army is a bit more complicated than just changing the rules a little bit, and with the Legacy army, you're going to have to get a little creative or really open your checkbook. There will be no Dark Elves released for the old world, obviously. The good news is that while Dark Elves have been ignored in Age of Sigmar, they have not been deleted, meaning a lot of the units that you will need for the old world you can still buy for Age of Sigmar, you just have to get new bases for them. If you navigate to the City of Sigmar's subpage on the GW website and scroll to near the bottom, you'll start to see the old Dark Elf units. Many of these units share a same kit, so these Dark Riders are also your Doomfire Warlocks. Your infantry also share a lot of kits. The point is, almost everything is here for the basics, including an Assassin, your Sorceress on Black Dragon, which can also be a Dreadlord on Black Dragon, and of course your Cold One Knights, which are very, very important, etc. And on the Daughters of Cain subpage, you should be able to find all your Witch Elf related needs, including the Shrine and the Cauldron. Basically anything that isn't a snake is usable. The only basic units you can no longer get for the Dark Elves are going to be your Bolt Thrower, your Dark Elf Shades, and your Harpies. The great news is that as of making this video, you can still get a Dark Elf Bolt Thrower used on eBay or Troll Trader or other used mini sites for a very fair price. I'd probably recommend just sticking with the GW sculpt. On the other hand, Shades are going to cost you a small fortune if you want to get the GW sculpts and you want to build a fairly large unit. Which is a tragedy, as these are some of the cooler Dark Elf units. It would have been nice if we got a plastic version of these at some point. For the official GW sculpt for Harpies, you're also going to have a hard and very expensive time getting the original sculpt, but the original sculpt is ugly anyways. For Warcry, GW did release a Harpy-like sculpt that a lot of people like to proxy. I don't like the looks of them. Honestly, Harpies is one unit where you should 100% go third party because GW just never did a very good job with this unit. And you're going to want some of these because they're very useful when you're building armies for your Dark Elves in the old world. For Shades and your Bolt Thrower, if you can't get your hand on the originals, you can make your own still using GW models with a little bit of spiky bits and some conversion work for the Eagle Bolt Thrower for the High Elves and Wood Elf Glade Guard for your Shades. If you're feeling really lazy, you can probably just paint these up like their father left for cigarettes a decade ago and never came back, and they'd be passable. Outside of a Sorceress on foot or a Dreadlord on a dragon, you're going to have a harder time sourcing your hero units for the old world. If you want to get some of the old name characters for the old world like Marathi or Malekith or Lockyer, you're going to pay quite the premium for them on the secondhand market, and it's getting harder and harder to find these models in good shape. The more generic lords are not as bad, at least the ones on foot. They're cheap enough you can probably afford them, but expensive enough you're going to lie to your wife about how much you spent. The generic lords on either Cold Ones or Pegasi though are actually quite expensive and hard to get a hold of. There are some Warcry models that would work for Lords on Foot, but otherwise, if you can't afford these or can't find these and want to stick to GW official models, you're going to have to do some conversions with either High Elves, Wood Elves, some of your generic units to make them more interesting, and maybe bring in some Bretonnians for their Pegasi. Not impossible by any stretch and could actually be a lot of fun, but you should be aware that you're going to have to put in the extra work and possibly the extra money. This is the part, like in my previous videos, where I talk about the third-party miniatures I like. And to be fully transparent, Dark Elves are one of the 3 Warhammer Fantasy armies I really care about that I collect, and as a habit, I like to do third-party miniatures in my armies just to mix it up for a little bit of diversity. But there are not a lot of third-party models for Dark Elves that I really enjoy. The exception being Harpies, which I feel like are such a vague unit. There's a lot of different manufacturers that can build something that can fit what your ideal Harpies are. And GW just never gave us a really good Harpy first party option. They're all just terrible. These are some of my favorite options. Mantic Harpies are a very safe choice and a lot more bestial. Raging Heroes makes a beautiful sculpt, but they're hard to rank up, which is okay for Harpies. And I think White Angel makes some good Harpies as well. Outside of Harpies, there's not a lot of third-party manufacturers for Dark Elves that I'd really recommend. I always have issues with either scale or ranking them up or just proportions that don't fit in with the GW models. I see Raging Heroes get recommended a lot, and I do think they have beautiful sculpts. I'm not trying to insult the maker, but outside of their Harpies, I just don't feel like the range fits in with GW models very well aesthetically. I also think they're a little over-sexualized, and even though they do a lot of ball joints on their miniatures so they're posable, I still have issues ranking them up at times. Blander miniatures are okay, especially for some of their infantry units, but I do think their elves come off a little blocky, and maybe a bit bland compared to GWs. I don't know, just something about this range doesn't really do it for me, although I do think they are fine, and when printed at the right scale, they blend pretty okay. These are also genuinely pretty affordable. I see Last Sword get recommended a lot, but again, these are more realistically proportioned models, and they might look really nice if you did a whole army in them, but if you're trying to mix them with GW models like I try to do, they just don't work very well. Hollow miniatures seem to be relatively new, and to be frank, I don't have a lot of experience with them, but they're very popular on Reddit right now, and just going from the pictures, they appear like they will scale okay. And I'm actually excited to get a few of these ordered for myself. The 2 third-party designers I would most likely recommend to people would be Lubart and White Angel. I think they match the Dark Elves aesthetic pretty well. They scale pretty okay. They're not quite to Games Workshop's heroic proportions, but they do mix and match okay, especially the White Angel. If you get them printed at a scale of around 88% or 89%, they look really great alongside of GW's original models. This is just my opinion, of course, and also just scratching the surface. I'm sure people in the comments will mention what third-party designers they like to use. They usually do in my other videos. I'd also recommend going to the 9th Age forums and getting onto their sub-forum for their Dread Elves. You'll find a sticky thread full of manufacturers who make Dark Elves like miniatures that might fit whatever you're trying to do. I will be sure to leave a link in the comments. And that sort of brings us to our final topic, how they play and feel on the tabletop. Not only in power level, which is important, but also how they feel in relation to their lore. Do they feel like a Dark Elves army? And before I say anything else, let me just say I think Dark Elves are in a good spot. They play well, not overpowered, but not in the bottom of the barrel either. And I think if you enjoy the lore behind them, you will enjoy how they play on the tabletop. That being said, I do have a lot of nitpicks that I think you should know before you really start investing into building these. And that's especially true when it comes to feel, because while overall I think they did a pretty good job for a legacy army, there are some pretty serious misses. Because they are a legacy army, it's probably wrong to expect the same level of detail with the High Elves as some of the supported factions, but I can't help but feel like there's just a chunk of rules that are missing. Murderous is supposed to be a really nice Dark Elf only perk, but unless you play with the Renegade rule set, it is an absolutely worthless rule, and that seems to be a big oversight. But it's far from the only one. The Black Guard of Nagaron are supposed to be the mirrored unit of the Phoenix Guard for the High Elves, the elite of the Dark Elves, yet they're classified as regular infantry rather than heavy infantry, which is a pretty minor thing, but combine that with the fact that now the Dread Halberd is worse than the regular one, and it's kinda disappointing. The Dark Elves have a special weapon called the Whip of Agony, and baked into its cost is the fact that it grants Strike First. However, only High Beast Lords can equip it, but High Beast Lords already have the special rule Strike First, which makes the whip a dead item. Overall, these things are very minor, and the Renegade rule set does fix them, but if you're not allowed to use that rule set, it really points to how much less polished these legacy armies have, which is something you might have to deal with. Furthermore, as a mirror to the High Elves, I feel like the Dark Elf list could really benefit from a mirrored version of the Elven Honors. Court intrigue and jockeying for power is such an important part of Dark Elf lore, it would have been really nice to have that reflected on the tabletop in some way. It also would have been nice if the Cain theme units got a little bit more love. The Witch Elves themselves are a great unit, you're going to use them probably in a lot of your list, but the Shrine and the Cauldron are just finicky and borderline worthless. You're probably not going to see them much in any semi-competitive list, they're going to be more of a showpiece than anything else, which really leaves a dragon mounted character as your only WoW unit that you're going to see on your tabletop with any regularity. But it's not all negative. The people who made these legacy lists, or the old world in general, clearly have passion for the setting. Your hero units fit into what a Dark Elf should be and are very strong on the tabletop. Outside of the whip, the magical items for the Dark Elves are very well done. The Dark Elf lore, while very small, is still fairly thematic, and it is an okay lore. You can use this, although you'll probably end up using battle magic and say demonology more often than their own unique lore magic. And I do love that they kept their Eternal Hatred special rule when they're played against the High Elves. It's not unique to this edition, but I appreciate that they kept it. And I appreciate that it's still not mirrored in the High Elves. It really plays into the lore of who these two factions are and how they feel about each other.
I feel bad for you.
I don't think about you at all.
Speaking purely to how they play on the tabletop, your Dark Elves army is going to feel like a glass cannon. They can put out a lot of wounds, but can't really take a counterpunch, and I feel like that's very thematic for an army based on being coastal raiders and pirates. The overall power level of the army is probably middle of the pack. People have won tournaments with them. You're not going to get to the point where you feel like you played everything correctly, but you lost because your army didn't have good enough rules, at least at this point in 1.5 in the old world. The internal balance for the Dark Elves, however, is not great. There are units that you're going to see in every list, and there's units you're going to almost never use in any kind of semi-competitive list. There are clear winners and clear losers when it comes to the Dark Elves army list, and they're going to become very apparent to you after only a couple of games. And unfortunately, some of those clear losers are some of the most thematic and interesting units of the Dark Elves. The Black Guard of Nagaron or the Executioners are probably the units that first drew you to the Druchii. But the high cost combined with the natural low toughness of any elves makes these very hard to work into any semi-competitive list. But on the other hand, Cold One Knights are the clear winners of the Dark Elves units, and you're going to see them in every list, casual or not. Which is totally fine, of course, but do keep in mind that they are stuck with the stupidity rule. Now, with the base leadership of 9, even without a Dreadlord, you are likely to pass your stupidity test, much more often than not. But due to human nature, you are only going to remember the roles you fail. With the clarification that came from the 1.5 FAQs, if your unit fails a leadership test, it doesn't do anything for that turn. No movement, no nothing. No matter how rare it is, your most expensive non-hero unit being taken out of the game for a turn and an I go and then you go setup is going to feel really bad and cause a lot of frustration at times. But they are so essential to the Dark Elves, it would be incredibly difficult to play without them at any point level above 1,000. So it is something you have to live with and play around. Besides your elite infantry and some of your centerpiece models, each unit feels like they have a role to play with a cohesive identity. Most of your lists are going to have a lot of Dark Riders, a lot of basic infantry, some Cold One Knights, and some Harpies, which really plays into their Coastal Raider identity. It's not like, say, the Skaven, which I feel are forced to play a non-thematic list if they want to be semi-competitive. You can make a list that looks like Dark Elves, play very well on the tabletop. And that's about all I have to say on the topic. I do hope this video helped make up your mind one way or the other on the Dark Elf army in the old world. In honor of the Druchii, rather than my normal in-video screen, I'm going to leave you with this meme. Enjoy. And as always, thanks for watching.